Computer before I forget. There we go. Okay. So as we begin our monthly meeting, welcome everyone. Let's give a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Max. Max Ferlauto is a fifth-year PhD candidate in Karen Burghardt's lab in the University of Maryland Entomology Department. He is studying insect conservation in cities and in suburban landscapes. Max grew up in Arlington, Virginia, and was briefly a master gardener himself before graduating from Juanita College with a degree in plant ecology. So with that, let's virtually welcome Max.
Hello, everyone. You can all hear me? I think so.
Yep, we can hear you great.
So yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm excited to be talking about my research. This is a very good time to talk about my research because the leaves are beginning to fall. So with that, let's begin. Yeah, so I'm from the Entomology Department at the University of Maryland in Karen Burghardt's lab. And this is Karen Burghardt in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. It's a relatively new lab, but what we study is how plants and insects and people all interact in managed landscapes. So a managed landscape would be a managed forest or the side of a street, or what I'm particularly interested in, a backyard. So the work that I do is primarily takes place in suburban yards. So to begin with, I just kind of want to briefly talk about the framing of my research, which is looking at our backyards as a ecosystem. It's a place that we use, yes, but it's also an ecosystem for the many different plants and animals that live there. And as master gardeners, as Maddie mentioned, I was a master gardener for a bit of time. As master gardeners, we can have kind of a complicated relationship with insects. Some we know are pests for sure. Some we know are beneficial. Some are benign. We're not sure about others. But what I want to say is that overall, most bugs are good. The pest species that we have, although we do have pest species, generally there are only a couple species. The majority of species are either benign or they're beneficial. And they're really important in our backyard ecosystems. So I've just tried to show some of the ecosystem services or benefits that insects have. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see a bee pollinating a flower, right? Pollinator services is a huge component to not only our agricultural system, but also in our backyards, vegetable gardens. If you want to grow squash or tomatoes or all these things, you want to make sure you have a robust pollinator community. Some pollinators can only pollinate particular groups of plants. For instance, this is a spring beauty bee, and it can only feed off of spring beauties. So there are a lot of interesting interactions as well. If we kind of move along the line here, this is not a spider. It's not an insect. It's a spider, but it is eating a mosquito right now. So that's a great ecosystem service, predation of some of our pests. And on the far right-hand corner, you see a hoverfly larva. So a hoverfly, those are those little kind of yellow and black, almost bee-like flies that you might see in your garden. Well, their larvae are actually really great at feeding on aphids. So we have some pest control right there. In the top left-hand corner, we see a caterpillar with these white, almost egg-like structures on it. Well, those are actually cocoons of a parasitic wasp, which is parasitizing and killing this caterpillar. So here we have more pest control, and I'll talk more about parasitic wasps a bit later on. In the middle, we have a bluebird feeding on a caterpillar. Now, this is a huge benefit of many insects, is that they support higher food chains. breeding bird populations are really dependent on insects as they're creating their fledgling young. And then finally, in the top right-hand corner, we have kind of a disgusting element of insect ecosystem services, but very important. Decomposition and the cleaning of carcasses is also a very important role that insects play. So overall, I want to say to you all, insects are for the most part pretty good. But unfortunately, we're seeing declines, especially of particular groups like moths and butterflies and those beneficial natural enemy pest control species that I've mentioned to you. We're seeing declines, especially in urban areas. Some people have talked about the insect apocalypse, and there's debate around how broad the breadth of these declines. But what's clear is there are particular groups that are being heavily affected. So two of those groups are what I've studied. I study Lepidoptera, which is the order of insects that encompasses butterflies and moths. And these are important pollinators, especially at night. As I mentioned, they're food sources for birds, but they're also important to maintain populations of those pest control species. So the other group that I study are parasitic wasps, and these are natural enemies of many pests. They reduce the pest populations in our yards. But if you were to get rid of all of your caterpillars, for instance, there would be nothing for the parasitic wasps to feed on. So that's kind of what I mean by maintaining some caterpillars are important for maintaining those beneficial pest control species. So parasitic wasps take a variety of forms. I think they look very cool. Some can be smaller, some can be larger. They might be different shapes. They might have different wing patterns, different colors. Some are wingless. But most of them are actually very, very small. So here on the far right, we have a parasitic wasp in the family Aphelinidae, and it's smaller than the head of a pin. And it needs to be this small because it parasitizes these aphids. So the yellow aphids that you're looking at are alive and they're feeding on the plant, but these tan-colored ones have actually been parasitized. And that this hole in the bottom here is where, so basically what happens is the parasitic wasp will lay its egg within the aphid. The larva will eat the aphid from the inside out, and that hole there is where the parasitic wasp emerges then. So very interesting life cycles. A lot of them also parasitize caterpillars. So here we have a caterpillar. This is a tobacco hornworm, which some of you might be familiar with. Looks like it's feeding on a tomato here. And these white things hanging down are the cocoons of a parasitic wasp. The parasitic wasp has laid its egg in the caterpillar, and the larvae have fed on the caterpillar, and then the larvae pupate in these white cocoons on the outside. And then, the cocoons will fall off and the caterpillar will then die. So we have some pest control going on right here. And sometimes the parasitic wasp will actually stay within the pupating caterpillar. You know how caterpillars are going to, turn into a chrysalis or a pupa, and then out from that will come a butterfly or a moth. Well, sometimes, as we found in the lab, instead of a moth emerging from a pupa, you have a parasitic wasp. The caterpillar was parasitized, and then throughout that cycle, the parasitic wasp stayed in there. So we have situations like that occur as well. So just to kind of reiterate, having a stable caterpillar population can maintain those natural enemy populations that we're talking about. If you were to just spray pesticides all across your yard and kill every single caterpillar, you would also be uh, depriving these parasitic wasps of all food. And so they would go away as well. And then if for some reason you had an outbreak of a pest caterpillar, you wouldn't have any of those parasitic wasps anymore to take care of. Now, in the United States, about 41% of urban land is residential. And our residential practices can play a substantial role in the ecology of cities. And these practices can either be harmful or they can create habitat for these beneficial insects. Now, we know a lot about creating habitat for active insect life stages. So a big one is we know to plant pollinator flowers for adults. Here, a monarch butterfly is feeding off an aster. This is a great pollinator plant that you can plant in your yards. And we know a good amount about that. We also know to plant native host plants for larvae. So the monarch butterfly caterpillar can only feed off of milkweed. And this is just one example. There are many other examples. If you know the spice bush swallowtail can only feed off of spice bush. The list goes on and on. So we're pretty clear about these life stages, but we know less about protecting the stages that overwinter. And pretty much all stages can overwinter. We do have overwintering adults actually too. But yeah, we know a lot less about this. It's dangerous to be an insect in the winter. For one thing, the temperatures can go below freezing. And as an insect, you really want to avoid ice crystals forming in your body. They can rupture your cells and kill you. But there's also very little food to eat. The leaves have dropped off the trees. And generally, there's also high predation as there's a scarcity of food. So everything's trying to eat you. So as an insect, you'll come up with a variety of overwintering strategies. If we focus on moths, some will overwinter above ground in a cocoon. So this is a polyphemus moth, which is a really big moth. And it will form these cocoons from trees or branches. You might overwinter above ground on a branch as an egg mass. This is the eastern tent caterpillar. And once they hatch, they'll form those tents. As I mentioned, you might overwinter as an adult in the leaf litter. Here we have a mourning cloak butterfly. And we also have a question mark butterfly, which is, if you look at the margin of the wing, it almost looks like a fallen leaf. So there's some good camouflage occurring there as well. We also find a lot of caterpillars overwintering within leaves themselves. So they're either going to mine between the upper and bottom part of the leaf. They're going to roll the leaf over and create these little shelters, or they're going to create a casing on the outside of the leaf itself, right? So when the leaves fall, presumably these caterpillars are overwintering within the leaves as well. This is one that you may be familiar with. Here we have an Isabella tiger moth or a woolly bear caterpillar, and these will overwinter within the fallen leaves. And you'll see them around now too. If you drive down a country road, you'll see them trying to cross. And many moths also overwinter below ground in these pupal chambers, like the pink striped oakworm, for example. So these are some of these overwintering strategies. We know a lot less about where parasitic wasps overwinter, but we think a good number of them overwinter within the host. So, if we have this pink striped oakworm overwintering, generally in the spring, this moth will emerge, but sometimes a parasitic wasp will emerge if if it's been parasitized. So we might have cases like that as well. But each year we remove about 35 million tons of yard waste from urban properties, and much of it is made of leaf litter. And just to give you a sense, that's about the same amount of municipal plastic waste that we produced each year. So it's a huge amount of material. And we're basically taking these overwintering insects and we're moving them to a place where they can't complete their life cycle. The side of a road, or we're bagging them. There are other strategies. We might shred leaf litter. We might create leaf piles. And part of my research is figuring out, okay, if we want to preserve these beneficial insects, what should we do? And so I ask a variety of questions in my research. Does litter management affect Lepidoptera? Remember, those are the moths, and parasitoid wasp emergence. Does litter management affect Lepidoptera and parasitoid wasp diversity and community composition? What are possible mechanisms for these changes? And what are the implications for what we should do in our backyards? So there's a lot of questions that I'm asking here, and I'll try and speed through some of the answers for you. We might have to skip some parts, but we'll see. So one of the questions I was asking was, is it different to remove leaves from an area that is more maintained versus an area that is less maintained? So to test these questions, we recruited 20 homeowners in suburban Maryland between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And within each of the homes, we asked the homeowner, okay, where's an area that you would consider to be unmaintained? The leaf litter has been left alone year after year. The grass is unmown. Generally, this is in a not so visible area of the yard. And then where is an area that you would consider to be maintained? This is generally a front yard or something, a forward-facing area. So then within each of these sections, we removed or retained leaf litter. So in an unmaintained zone, we would remove a section of leaves, and in a maintained zone, we would retain a section of leaves. So there are 4 treatments, 4 experimental treatments. And then in the spring, we placed emergence traps over each plot. And emergence traps are basically these tents that we use to collect insects as they come out of the ground in the spring. And we collected every 10 days from March until July. And actually, we had some traps in Howard County too. So if you've seen these signs or seen these tents a couple years ago, that's what was going on. And then we repeated this experiment again in half of the homes for a second year. So what are some of the findings that we found? Well, if we focus on moths, first of all, we found that removing leaves reduced Lepidoptera emergence by about 42% in 2021 and 48% in 2022. And this occurred in both areas where you maintained your leaves and areas where you removed your leaves. So there's a fairly strong and consistent pattern. Removing leaves reduces the number of moths that emerge from your yard. Interestingly, though, we found that maintained areas actually had more emergence than unmaintained areas. And I'll talk a little more about that, but regardless, retaining your leaf litter is how you're going to improve the number of those beneficial moths in your yard. Moving to parasitic wasps, it was a little bit, not as clear patterns here. We did find that maintained areas had more wasp emergence than unmaintained areas, similar to what we were finding with the moths. That was very clear in 2021. In 2022, things weren't as clear, but generally there is this pattern of maintained areas having greater emergences than unmaintained areas. But within each of those litter management areas, retaining leaf litter is always better than removing leaf litter. And then the question is, we know about the emergence of insects. We know about just pure numbers, but what about the diversity? What about the biodiversity of these different groups? Is it dominated by one species, or do we have many different species? Well, to start with the moths, we found that areas where litter was removed had about 50% less Lepidoptera species, or less Lepidoptera diversity. And that was consistent in both areas that were maintained and areas that were unmaintained. And the community of moths that emerged from the yard was not dominated by any one species. So we had a lot of different groups coming out of the ground. And not only did we have a lot of different taxonomic groups, we also had a lot of different life histories. So we had caterpillars that feed on the outside of the leaves, and we had caterpillars like leaf miners that feed on the in between the bottom and the top of the leaf, so in between the leaves. And we had groups that roll the leaves, and we also had groups that eat the fallen leaves. So this is something you might not think that caterpillars do, but there's a bunch of caterpillars that feed on decaying leaves. They're actually decomposers. And for example, one of them is this hair streak over here. So this is a butterfly you might see in your yard. And while as an adult, it pollinates flowers, as a larva, it eats fallen leaves. So pretty cool. All right, now I'm going to point you to this very messy figure, and I'm going to walk you through it because it's actually pretty cool. So what this is it's an ordination plot. We've taken each collection, which is represented by these gray dots. So every time we went out to a particular plot and collected the insects that emerged from that particular emergence trap on that particular collection date, and we had 9 collection dates over the course of a year, that's what those gray dots are. And then each of these red words is a species of moth. And basically how you read this is the closer one of these red species words is to one of these treatment circles, the more associated it is with that. And you can also like see how far apart the treatment circles are from each other. So for instance, what we found is that earlier collections have very different communities of moths than later collections. So the species are very different earlier in the year than later in the year. And that kind of makes sense, right? Different things come out of the ground at different times. We also found that unmaintained areas had very different communities than maintained areas. And if we focus on, looking at what these species are in particular, here we have 2 of them. So here, one of them, the grass leaf miner, right? Well, that's associated with this yellow color here, which is where we have removed leaves in a maintained area. Okay, well, if we think about this, these maintained areas are generally in the front yard. This is where there's lawns. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We would have moth that feeds on grass. But then interestingly, this Renia species is more associated with the unmaintained plot. So this is the darker colors. Unmaintained plots. Well, if you think about this particular moth and you look into its life history, you see that this is actually one of the decomposers. So these caterpillars will feed on the fallen leaves. So it just kind of makes intuitive sense here. But we are seeing differences in the life history and how it's affected by the leaf litter management treatments. So if you're a caterpillar that mines leaves, or if you're a caterpillar that rolls leaves, you're more highly affected by litter management. And you can see that because areas where you remove leaves are this kind of orange and yellow color, and areas where you retain leaves are this purplish color. And they're divided into both unmaintained and unmaintained areas. But regardless, just focusing on the litter management itself, we see there are fewer miners and fewer leaf rollers coming out of the ground where you remove your leaf litter. Not only that, we find that moths that feed very specifically on only certain groups of plants are more highly affected by removing leaf litter. So what that basically means is that a pest species, a generalist that's going to feed on everything from your peach tree to your cabbage, those aren't as affected by removing leaf litter. Instead, it's these more rare species that are generally only feeding on one particular type of tree or plant, like an oak specialist or something that only feeds on maples. Those are going to be more highly affected by removing your leaf litter. Okay, so now let's move on to parasitic wasps. So here we found that areas where you maintain, so the maintained areas versus unmaintained areas, have lower diversity. So those unmaintained areas in your backyard, behind your shed, they have a lot of great parasitic wasp diversity, a lot of beneficial insect diversity that can provide pest control services to the rest of your yard. And here we have this graph again. This one's a little bit easier to read here. What we're seeing is that in areas where you remove leaves, so that's this orange color, in areas where you retain leaves, that's this purplish color, they diverge. And we also see these certain groups that are associated. One of them, so these are now acronyms because some of these scientific names are very long, but so these are acronyms, but ELPH stands for the Eulophid family. Now, eulophids tend to parasitize leaf mining caterpillars. Well, that kind of makes sense because we saw that leaf mining caterpillars are highly affected by leaf litter removal. So this divergence of species coming out of the ground based upon whether you remove or you retain your leaves tracks both the parasitic wasp and what the parasitic wasp feeds on. So now let's think about some mechanisms for what we're finding here. First, I want to point you to looking at the data in a slightly different way. So what we did is we divided the early and the late part of the seasons for both years. And we wanted to see if that would change any of the data that we were getting. And what we found was in maintained zones, we're seeing differences early in the season and not late in the season. Early in the season is before May. That's how we divided it before the trees had fully leafed out. So that led us to think, okay, well, what's happening early in the year that's not happening late in the year? And what's happening more dramatically in maintained areas than unmaintained areas? Well, and here's another way to look at it, right? So if we just look at the emergence over time and we compare this purple retained leaf area with the red removed leaf area, we see that we're seeing these differences, early in the spring, and we're not seeing them as much in the summer. Well, leaf litter may act as a blanket that is insulating the moths that overwinter below ground from drastic temperature variations. And if you know anything about Maryland springs, you know that one day you can have a 30-degree freezing temperature, and the next day it could be 80 degrees. So that's probably why we're seeing these differences earlier on in the season, and we wanted to test this. Right, so yeah, if you imagine a leaf litter is like a blanket, and you remove that blanket, that's going to freeze or do something bad to those pupating caterpillars. So to test this, we measured the soil temperature in each plot. So what I'm showing you here, this red dashed line is the average daily temperature in both maintained and unmaintained plots. And there's some variation that goes on. But then if we overlay the temperature from where you retain leaf litter, you see there's a lot less variation, right? So what this is showing is that removing leaf litter increases damaging temperature variation, and that can be harming these insects. So that kind of makes intuitive sense as well. Why might there be more insects emerging from maintained areas than unmaintained areas? Well, for one thing, maintained areas might have more light, and they might have more ground cover and more turf and more ornamental plants. So there's actually a lot of resources that more designed and forward-facing ornamental parts of our yard have. And those can actually be very attractive to different types of moths and parasitic wasps. But within both maintained and unmaintained areas, removing leaf litter is bad for emergence. So kind of the takeaway here is that if you have to keep your leaf litter in one part of your yard, even though it's kind of hard to do, you should probably do it in those more maintained areas where you have all that floristic quantity of plants. And yeah, that can be hard because front yard, you don't want your yard to look messy, but ecologically, that's where the most amount of benefit is coming. Okay, so what are the implications then? I've talked a little bit about them, but to think a little bit more, one of the implications of this research is that we can make drastic changes to the ecological value of our yard in a single year. So what I'm showing here is basically in a maintained area, if you leave your leaves, you can increase moth emergence by 77%. That was 2021, 63% in 2022. Right? That's just a single year of leaving your leaves. So we may think of our yards as these depauperate areas where suburbia has extinguished all of the nature in the world, but that's not really true. If we do small management strategies, we can actually increase the number of beneficial insects very quickly. But not everyone can do this, right? You may live in an HOA, or you don't want your neighbors to think your front yard is unsightly, things like that. So what are some alternative strategies? Well, to test this, we actually moved to a forested experiment. And this project has a lot of different components, but really what I want to show you is in this area that wasn't in suburbia, we were able to have a lot more research plots with a lot more research treatments. So this is showing you each yellow dot is a group of treatments of litter manipulations that occurred in these different types of forests. And this actually occurred at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center near Annapolis. So here we set up these plots where instead of only having 2 treatments, removing or retaining leaf litter, we had 4 treatments. So we would go to a plot and we collect the leaves that had fallen, and we'd rake it, and then we would weigh the leaves and divide them into 4 quadrats, 4 components. One of those we would mulch. We would run through a yard waste mulcher, and we would create these treatments here. So here we have a raked litter treatment. We have that shredded treatment that you just saw, we mulched. We have a control. So that basically means it's the same amount of leaves that had fallen. And then we have an addition, which is double the amount of leaves, right? So here we're looking at what are some alternative litter management strategies. If you can't remove your leaves, maybe is shredding going to be okay? Or is moving leaves into a leaf pile going to be okay? So that's basically what this project was testing. We also buried temperature probes in the ground again. We wanted to see if, this was consistent with what we were finding in the suburban sites. And then in the spring, again, we placed emergence traps over each of the treatments. And in looking at the temperature data, we found, yeah, this is very similar to what we were seeing in the removal treatments. There's a lot more temperature variance where you remove leaves. So the red color is a temperature probe that was placed above ground, and you see, well, of course, there's tons of variance. There's no blanket at all. And then if you remove leaves, yeah, there's still a good amount of temperature variation. But if you have a control or you add leaves, there's enough of this blanket that, this line isn't as bumpy. So that's kind of how you can think about it. But what we did find is that mulching is no better than litter removal for Lepidoptera emergence. So going from left to right, reading on the x-axis, we see an addition plot, a control plot, a mulch plot, and a remove plot. So mulching your leaves reduces the number of emerging moths by about 48%. And removing your leaves reduces by about 37%. So mulching is not a good strategy. And I mean, that makes sense, right? If you're a caterpillar and you're in the leaf litter and you're being run through a shredder, you're probably not going to survive. But we're not seeing any differences between the control and the addition. So retaining your leaf litter is great. But if you have to create those leaf piles, taking litter from one area of the yard, putting it on top of litter from another area yard, maybe in an area that's less, maybe it's not on the grass or it's in a garden bed, something, maybe it looks a little more tidy in that area. Well, we're actually seeing you're getting the same number of emerging moths. And what that likely means is there's a good number of moths that are overwintering within the leaf litter itself that you can transport to another area. The ones below ground, they, you can't dig every single one of them up out of the ground, but for the ones that live or overwinter within the leaf litter itself, by moving them to another area, they can complete their life cycle, as long as you're not composting them or shredding them or bagging them or bringing them to the side of a road. So a lot of takeaways here. For the first question, we found that litter removal reduces Lepidoptera, but not parasitoid wasp emergence. We were finding more Lepidoptera and parasitoid wasps in maintained plots. When we look at diversity and community composition, we see that unmaintained areas have higher wasp diversity, and different litter management strategies shift the type of species that emerge from the ground. And in terms of Lepidoptera, we found that removing litter reduces Lepidoptera diversity. There's less biodiversity when you remove leaf litter. And the area where you do that shifts the type of species that are coming out. We're getting different species of moths emerging from maintained areas than unmaintained areas. And some possible reasons for this could be, by removing leaf litter, you're changing the ability of the soil to buffer temperature changes. You're removing that blanket. And maintained areas actually have a lot of resources that are valuable to both Lepidoptera and parasitoid wasps. They're not barren, they're not depauperate. So retaining leaf litter in those areas is the best area to do it. We know that if you can't retain leaves where they fall, don't mulch them. Just move them to another area of your yard. So just as in the summer, when we plant these native plant gardens, these pollinator gardens, and we're attracting these beneficial insects to our yards, maybe we're attracting parasitic wasps so that they can feed on the aphids that are on my on my kale over here, or we're attracting bees to pollinate my I think these are cucumbers over here, right? That, we're attracting these beneficial insects to our yard. We also want to make sure that in the winter we're conserving their overwintering habitat by taking leaves and retaining them or moving them into a garden bed or area to keep. So this research is the first quantification of litter management strategies, right? Throughout the news, you see article after article of, leave your leaves. And they're right. And this research really proves that. Before this, we didn't know. We just kind of assumed that removing leaf litter would be bad, but now we know it cuts the number of emerging moths in half by doing this, right? And we know that it reduces the diversity of moths in your yard. And we know it changes the composition of parasitoids in your yard. And the more diverse parasitoids you have, the greater the chance that there's going to be a species that is going to target the particular pest you're trying to control. So that's been the research that I've done for the past couple years, and it wouldn't be possible without everyone in the Burghardt Lab. So a thank you to them, and of course to all the volunteer homeowners who let me have these emergence traps in their yards for 2 years. So yeah, with that, I'll take any questions. I think we have about 15 minutes or so.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. Let's give him a virtual round of applause. And yes, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. There is also a Q&A feature. And then we are welcome to, if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question too. We currently have one question that asks, they were saying, will they apply to raised beds as well? Meredith, do you want to provide more context on that question? While we wait for that, there's another question. Thank you so much, Max. We are in a townhome community and want to keep leaves in our flower beds. How do we keep the leaves from blowing over into the neighbor's bed, yard, sidewalk, etc.?
That's a good question. Yeah. So for my research, actually, I had to use kind of a netting material to make sure the leaves wouldn't blow away. In your yard, I would suggest they have actually these really pretty kind of edging fences that are low to the ground. I think that would do a great job of kind of retaining leaves in your beds.
Very cool. Next question. How about just shedding those leaves that land in the driveway? Or I think they may be shredding. Is that what you meant, Sue?
Yeah, I mean, I think my research is showing that any shredding is going to kill anything within the leaf litter. So keeping that to a minimum. If you can move those leaves to another area of the yard. But I do know some people get just so many leaves that they really, if you move them to another area, they would just be a leaf pile. So yeah, what you have to do what you have to do.
Great. Does anyone have any further questions? That's all of them in the Q&A section. Here we go. For those who, whoops, that's my question there. For those who do not have space in their yard to maintain leaves, would you have concern about leaves being temporarily bagged to move to another garden, for example, the rake and take program? And that she's referring to, we have a program in Howard County where we match people who want leaves to people who want to get rid of leaves.
Wow, that's super cool. I didn't know that was a thing. That sounds awesome. Yeah, I mean, temporarily, I guess it depends on how long. If you're putting leaves in a black plastic trash bag and you're leaving them on an 80-degree day for 2 days in the sun before transporting them, that's probably going to fry all the insects. But if it's maybe if it's a paper bag and it's a cooler day and it's only for a couple days, yeah, I think they should survive. I think so.
Next question is, why do the maintained areas have more moth emergence? Is it possible that it's easier to find the moths in these areas versus in forest areas? Is it hard to detect them?
So we use the same emergence trap. So basically an emergence trap is sealed at the bottom. So anything that's coming out of a square foot of the ground is going to end up in those traps. The reason I think that there are more moths in maintained areas is because a couple things. There's so this is just sort of qualitatively when going to these different homes, an unmaintained area doesn't actually have a lot of like low vegetative material. Um, and front yards, maybe you have a lot more kind of smaller herbaceous ornamental plantings. And that might be attracting a lot of insects. Also, turf is associated with a number of species, and not all of them are pests. Not all of them feed on grass, but grass can be a nice uh, kind of hiding space. So I think these maintained areas, just because they're kind of maintained in our eyes, doesn't mean they're not good for beneficial insects as well.
Great. And the next question asks, I read somewhere that leaving leaves may cause more mosquitoes. Is that true?
Leaving leaves, so in our traps, we didn't find more mosquitoes. We didn't find any differences because we also looked at some other things as well, some other different species, and we didn't find any more ticks and we didn't find any more mosquitoes. But if maybe if you have like big cup-shaped leaves, like a sycamore leaf or something, um, really what's going to cause mosquitoes is low vegetative material. So higher than leaves, we're talking like ivy. Maybe you have ivy in your yard, or um, you have what's it called? Vinca minor. Is that like a periwinkle? I forget the common name, but kind of those low evergreen type. Those can be good hiding places for mosquitoes, but leaf litter itself, we weren't really seeing that. Yeah.
Someone asked, is it okay if our landscape company just blows our leaves into woods nearby? Our community has an ocean of leaves.
Yeah. I, if your home abuts a um, a forest, that could be a possibility. I have not done research looking at leaf blowers, so I'm not sure if the leaf blower is going to desiccate the insects or if it's going to be too hot for them. So I don't know that. Um, I will say if you are going to move leaves from your yard into a forested area, you want to make sure you understand kind of the permits of that area. So some people, they'll mow their lawn and then they'll have the grass company just dump the clippings into a pile on like county property, and I know that the county is not happy about that. So if it's like a huge pile of leaves and it's on county property, they might be upset about that. Also, once you start creating piles that are that large, um, you could start having more ticks. Like there have been some studies that shown that very large piles of leaf litter can create ticks, areas for ticks. And kind of a low amount on the ground, it's not really an issue. But once you create these kind of like feet high piles, that could be an issue.
Someone asked if insects overwinter in pine needles.
Yes, they do. Well, yes, they do. Sometimes not like within the pine needles, but in the needles, themselves. A couple of the homes we had were dominated by pines.
Awesome. Yeah, someone made a note about you can't, in Columbia Association property, you can't blow your leaves into those designated areas.
Makes sense.
Um,
And the other thing I will say is once you create enough of a leaf pile, you know, you're actually making that area inhospitable to be an insect. If you imagine a huge pile of leaves and then it gets rained on, it's all tamped down and it forms almost this um, impenetrable layer of leaf mass. It's going to be hard for the insect to get oxygen. it's going to be hard for the insect to be able to tell what time, like when it's time to emerge. Temperatures are going to be very hot. It's almost going to be like a compost pile. So that's not what we're looking at. What we really want are kind of, if you have to pile your leaves or move them from one area to another, we're talking about like 6 inches or like a low amount of material.
Awesome. Thank you. If there's any remaining questions, we can probably take one or two more, or I guess we have a couple more minutes. And you're also welcome to unmute yourself now if someone wants to ask a live question. Someone asked, will enough rain penetrate to the soil to benefit perennials if unmatched leaves are 1 to 2 inches thick?
Oh yeah, that should be fine. In fact, some people actually use leaves to kind of mulch their beds. So yeah, that's definitely going to be fine.
Great. Any final questions for Max? And Max, would it be all right if someone had a question pop up to reach out to you by email?
Yes, I guess I thought I had my email on here, but I don't. Well, you can share my email.
Yeah, we will have it in the meeting minutes for everyone to reference if they would like. Okay, if there's no other remaining questions, let's again thank Max for joining us today and teaching us about leaving the leaves.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much again. And as we transition, we're going to transition to the admin portion of our meeting because today we flipped our agenda. So we started with the continued education portion with Max. And now we're going to move into some program updates and some committee updates. So we'll get into that now.
All right,
And
take care,
Max,
everyone.
thank you.
Bye.